You can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kate O'Dell and Joe Sternberg, and wouldn't be another week without some more fun on the classified documents discovery front. This time it's Mike Pence, former vice president, home where documents were discovered apparently in his home in Indiana, a couple of boxes that seemed to have classified markings. An aide turned them over immediately upon the vice president's orders to the National Archives, and he's cooperating with Congress. But I guess that leads to the question of how did it happen? How did they get there? There's some suggestion by the Pence camp that these were placed in mistaken fashion in the trucks, which piled up the boxes in the final days of administration, and somehow they ended up there and just had been stuck there. Sounds certainly plausible to me. But I guess, Kate, what does this mean for the investigations into Trump and Biden?
Well, I think it's exposing the silliness of having dueling special counsels. And the more number of instances of this that we have, I think the more likely it'd have to be settled by the voters, which is what we've been arguing is the appropriate process, as opposed to potentially indicting a former president who is mounting a run in 2024. I think the Pence documents have to be a point in favor of not indicting and hopefully winding down the special counsel's show as quickly as possible, because I don't think it's going to be a productive process. I do think you have to ask, these episodes are just so odd. It seems to me hard to understand how classified material could be treated so cavalierly. I mean, we do have an overclassification problem, and documents can be classified for reasons that can be influenced by political judgments. But that said, that's not up to the person who handles the information. And I do think it's here, the public has no real way of evaluating the episodes because we don't know whether these documents are out of date briefings or whether they are more seriously closely guarded secrets. So it's very hard, I think, for the public to judge these events other than to say there's clearly been some kind of breakdown in the process for handling this information, and some aides seem to not think it applies to them.
Well, on the point of overclassification, I observed this when I was a White House fellow in the Reagan administration. I had a pretty low-level clearance, but I did have a clearance, and I was working in the Domestic Policy Council staff, and we were preparing decision memos for the president. Not that I was an advisor or anything. I was sort of the process guy who put a couple of the decision memos together. And some of these would be classified on domestic issues, and it wasn't because they were really important secrets. It was because if they were released, they'd be embarrassing politically or betray somebody's argument, and they didn't want that to be public. So I think that's really overclassified. That's way too much of that is. That's a mistake, and there should be a review of those kinds of decisions. Of course, in these cases, we don't know if there's a lot more highly classified documents that were taken. According to the leaks, Donald Trump's was, and according to the reports on Biden, he also had some so-called code word classification documents, which are genuine secrets. But let's listen to Kevin McCarthy, House Speaker, talking about the distinction in his mind between the Biden and Pence documents.
There's a problem here. And I think what you had people, when Mike Pence found these, the first thing he did was provide them over. He's called Comer on the oversight and say, I want to work because I want to make sure this never happens again from any places. Unfortunately, the president, Biden, won't give us any information, and his is a little different. He's got classified document when he was a U.S. Senator. I don't understand how that even transpires. I do not understand how a U.S. Senator can take a classified document out of a SCIF if they're not stuffing it in their pants or somewhere else. I'm just not sure of that.
And Joe, he makes an important point because you go into a SCIF, according to everything I have read and reported on, you go in alone. You don't bring an aide who can look over your shoulder for the most part. So you go in alone, you look at it, and then you can't take it with you. So that's a fair point about the Biden documents versus Pence, where there seemed to have been, in the Pence case, a kind of willy-nilly piling documents onto the truck and as they're leaving office, and then they are dumped off at the house and sit there.
Yes, and I think that this is representative of part of the much bigger problem that we're going to end up here. And I think Kate alluded to part of that, which is that, by their nature, since these documents were classified, if they really are important secrets, the public will never know what was in these documents. So it will be very hard for anyone to reach any kind of independent judgment about, sort of whether they ought to have been classified in the first place or how much damage to national security might have been done here. But along with that, you are going to have this bigger problem where I already am starting to despair about whether we're going to get any answers to questions like how these documents did come to be outside of secure locations, or, how they got wandered off with or put into the wrong box, or that sort of thing. And that is a very important question for voters to have an answer to if we can ever get one as part of these investigations, because that does speak to the honesty and judgment of the people who are asking us to elect them. So I think it's sort of, that's definitely the right kind of question that Kevin McCarthy is getting to, but I will confess to a certain amount of pessimism about whether we're likely to ever really get a convincing answer to it.
Well, I think that all of the compounding news here from different actors, now 3 former senior officials, 1 current one, 2 former, 1 current president, suggests that nobody's going to be indicted here. I mean, certainly you can indict a sitting president under the Justice Department rules. And if you are going to indict Donald Trump for what he did, even though, he resisted returning those documents over a long period of time to the archives after they requested it and they had to be subpoenaed, he is, in the public mind, I think it's just impossible to make a distinction to indict the president and this kind of thing, unless there's new facts that we don't know about that'll be uncovered. And so both the special counsels might end up issuing reports, I guess, which will go to the Attorney General and may or may not be released at the Attorney General's discretion. So in that sense, Joe, you may find out that way some more details, but ultimately it could be that's about the only thing we do find out is we get a report and maybe some tisking, these folks shouldn't have done this and it needs to have a process that's better for handling them. And I guess that kind of warning would be appropriate and helpful to the next president and the vice president and others. But I don't think you're going to get any real major resolution here. And I don't think the Merrick Garland is going to appoint a special counsel for Mike Pence, even though Mike Pence is also going to be likely, possibly a presidential candidate. 3 special counselors for 3 presidential candidates. We're approaching Bolivian levels of political comedy. And I don't mean it comity, I mean comedy. So we've got a letter here that I want to get you folks to respond to. It's a listener letter, and it's from Jim Keegan from Seal Beach, California, and never been to Seal Beach, but sounds lovely. He writes, "The United Nations has seemingly and yet again proven itself irrelevant in connection with the war in Ukraine. Can Russia be kicked off the UN Security Council? And what is the United States' strategy vis-a-vis the UN? Do we need one?" And by that he means a strategy. And if so, what should it be? Kate, you want to help Mr. Keegan?
Well, it's a good question. And I think the war in Ukraine has exposed the limitations of large multilateral institutions like the United Nations, which is playing really no leadership role in managing the situation in Ukraine. Our columnist, Walter Russell Mead, has pointed out that a lot of the leadership is coming from individual nations and how important individual nations are as institutions. And I think that's one lesson of the war in Ukraine. I mean, I think our listener is just right. I mean, having Russia on the Security Council, we've long had abusers on the Human Rights Council. It's just not a serious institution at this point. And all of the ferment, all of the talks of discussions about donating material, how to help, it's really coming out of NATO and not the United Nations. So obviously, I think the Biden administration probably should have some strategy to get more out of the UN and make itself useful, particularly on the humanitarian side, where they could play more of a role. But I do think it's just a reminder that history is not over, that this idea that the UN can just sort out the world's problems is really a naive view of the world, as there's artillery war in Europe.
Well, yeah, the administration is loaded with what I would call liberal internationalists. I don't use that phrase in a negative way. They really believe in international institutions and their power and moral authority to help with events and to enforce global security. And I believe it's a fundamentally naive view of how the world works, but they believe it. But we're seeing in the UN, as Kate suggested, it's simply not capable of acting, not least because Russia has the veto power in the Security Council, as does China. And both of those governments are not going to allow the Security Council to act in a way that poses what Russia is doing, Joe. So I think we're left showing the fecklessness of the United Nations. And as Kate suggests, it's a coalition of the willing, which in this case is a coalition of NATO allies.
Yeah, I mean, to make a partial defense of liberal internationalism, which is not something that I usually would do. We have seen in this Ukraine conflict that international institutions can play a very, very important role. NATO is the institution that I'm thinking of here, which is, not just sort of a loose coalition of the willing. It is a formal treaty alliance with an institutional structure and a long track record of sort of bringing these countries together in Western Europe and the North Atlantic. And, they have made formal commitments to each other, which has really animated a lot of their approach to the Ukraine conflict. So I think that that is an example of an international institution that has actually proven itself very resilient and successful during this conflict. Now, the problem with the UN is that it was not set up to manage great power conflicts in this way, as evidenced by the fact that all of the great powers who are now in conflict with each other are stuck sitting next to each other at the Security Council. And yet we seem to be heading into a world where that kind of conflict is going to be at the fore again. I mean, where the main rivals for the US and our Western allies are going to be Vladimir Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. And the UN, with its global scope, when it includes everyone, it isn't really able to manage conflict between anyone. I think the problem there is that it is just too big, and since everyone is a member of it, it's not capable of really doing anything useful in the sort of conflict that we seem to be bracing ourselves for.
All right, Kate and Joe, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Keegan, for the question, and thank you all for listening. We're back every day with Potomac Watch and hope to catch you the rest of this week. Thanks for listening.